classroom setting is kind of nice.
There were times I wish I was homeschooled. That kind of stuff didn't exist.
I wish I wasn't homeschooled to some extent, but I got a better education from it, so. Yeah.
John Stuart Mill was that way, but there's a lot of people like that. But I love the school environment. I hate the real world. You have to like be physically productive.
Mm-hmm.
In the university, as Bill Murray says in Ghostbusters, they give us money and they don't expect anything, you know.
Yeah.
You just, he's hilarious. So yeah, the Book of J is kind of interesting. Mentioned that, but we should really talk about the tradition, because when we broach the Christian period, all sorts of things are happening in the Roman world, and obviously over the course of the next 200-300 years, Christianity is going to take over. And that, of course, puzzles people to death. Why did that happen? And why is it important for philosophy? Well, philosophy after that, or even during that period, through the changes, are the philosophers are Christian theologians. And they are the philosophers that we study all the way up to the moderns. And by the way, you don't really understand the modern period, I think. I mean, you can take modern philosophy and study it and do fine, but why were the moderns puzzled over the things they were? Why did that all happen? It only really makes sense when you look at the milieu that they were in and what they were dealing with. And so understanding how the Middle Ages transpired, what the thinking process was, how things developed out of all of that, certainly going to be an important part of even today, why things are the way they are today. A lot of the concepts that developed are still part of our vocabulary. We think of as common speech. So of course we have to look first at what Christianity was in order to try to figure out why were these philosophers then the way they were, what were they trying to reconcile. And the first one that we'll be working with tonight later on, once we talk about the Christian period in general, is St. Augustine, who's considered by many to be the father of the church. It seems odd, when you think, wait a minute, what about Jesus? What do you mean by father? That's kind of a weird thing. But Augustine is the theologian who basically established what became, for over 1,000 years, the basic philosophy, religion, dogma of the church. Wasn't the only one. I mean, he's, again, involved, interconnected with Jerome and others. His bishop, Ambrose, was significant. There's a lot of significant players. It's one thing that today, the way we study philosophy, we look at incremental, step-by-step developments as ideas get more complex, solve problems, create more problems, solve those problems, etc. Right? So all that stuff is absolutely fascinating, especially if you have the time and opportunity to study it. So Augustine is really significant. In fact, when we talk about the difference between a lot of faith-based communities here in Anchorage, you could see part of that through the difference between Augustine's dogma and the subsequent dogma that developed, that basically broke the traditions apart, so that when we look at the Protestant traditions, for the most part, there's course, a variety of Protestant developments. The English is completely different than what happened on continental Europe, but even so, the continental European Protestant movement, in one way of looking at it, certainly seems to be an attempt to continue following in Augustine's tradition, as opposed to the new evolving tradition that is the response that the church made to science. Which, by the way, is why a lot of people in town feel like there's a conflict between science and religion, is because the conflict did arise back in the Middle Ages, and the church settled it by saying, well, when you get right down to it, you've got reason and faith, and if something you believe with faith is in conflict with reason, you've got to change it, because reason trumps faith. That's the Catholic Orthodox position, right? And the Protestants said, no, it's faith, by faith alone, by Scripture alone. And so they wanted to stick to the old interpretations of it, despite the way it was being modified in order to kind of cohabit with scientific development. And so, gosh, if you're still following that tradition, you still have plenty of opportunity to see your particular religion as in conflict with science, because you haven't changed to adapt to what science has learned over 1,000 years of time, right? That's pretty significant. Not really 1,000 years. So, what year was it's roughly about the same time as Columbus. So
1492.
yeah, so while Columbus was discovering the New World, that was roughly about the time that Martin Luther.
Don't ask me why I remember that. It's a date, it's like imprinted into my brain.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, 1492?
Yeah.
I'm dyslexic, so I always remember it as 1429.
Hey,
Oh,
still
so
close.
95 theses. When did he hammer them onto the,
Diet of worms?
that's a place.
Huh.
Doesn't mean you should be eating worms. The diet is like a conference, and
Oh.
Worms is a place. So, no,
Oh.
you don't have to eat worms.
Okay.
That's great, though. It never would have occurred to me on seeing that.
I was like,
And
what?
then the next line says, at Waltberg Kessel.
So when was it? So I don't know how they would, but yeah, so roughly about the same time. Well, that's within 20 years anyway. So that's a pretty easy thing to remember, right? Discovery of North America, or the American continent. The European discovery. Obviously, there were other people there. So if your religious tradition is still Augustinian in nature, instead of and the alternative is essentially Thomas. So Thomism is the official dogma still today. And that was like 13 something, but it's a basic template that says, okay, so if reason and faith are in conflict, you go with reason. And that's why an awful lot of individuals that think of themselves as Christians think of Catholics as not Christian.
Mhm.
So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I was raised in a family that believed that Catholics were not actually Christian.
Well, I was raised Catholic, so when I heard that, I was like, what?
I don't know.
I could see the argument here locally. Mormons, by a lot of Christians, are not considered Christian, and yet, of course, the Mormons consider themselves the Latter-day, the Church of Latter-day Saints, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So they think of themselves as Christians too. The problem is you've got a lot of different kinds of Christianity.
Yeah.
And so, if you were a particular type of Christian and you feel like anyone else who's not a Christian of the same ilk as I am, they're not really Christian. That's essentially, I think, what's happening there.
That's how you divide people. There's
Yeah.
no unity there. Even though they have different beliefs of the same religion. They're
And
all
we
going,
kill one
"You're
another
not a
over these
Christian, You're not
differences."
a Christian, but yet you all go to Christian churches.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we wouldn't be here unless our ancestors were successful in killing other people
Yeah, that's true.
that believed different things. Because of the Protestant wars, the
Mm-hmm.
Huguenots wiped out France. Okay, you guys can believe what you want. Nah, I changed my mind. Thank you, France.
And Catholicism was very guilty in that.
Yeah, and now it's like the Church of Peace.
Yeah. Well, it used to be the church that controlled everything. They owned lands.
Yeah, there's a science fiction book that talks about what would have happened if the Pope had remained in charge of all of Europe, and
Yeah.
so that we live today. And one of the things the book suggests is we wouldn't have electricity.
We'd still be living in the Dark Ages.
Oil lamps.
You know,
Flame
fiefdom,
oil
serfdom
lamps.
all over everywhere.
However, so the first thing we have to talk about is this guy. Who was he? Never even pulled this up. Can you believe it's already this late in the year?
You know.
So, what on earth do I have here? That's just funny, the oldest webcam. $3,400-year-old. Canaan, now modern Syria. Isn't the internet great? You can find the most outrageously interesting things without even looking for them.
Yeah. And still not find what you were still actually looking for.
Yeah, what I wanted is the previous lecture, which would be here. No, that's the same one. Very good. Okay. So. What are we looking for? Early church fathers. So, yeah, there are resources that are just absolutely outrageous. I mean, if you're going to study history of Christianity, notice these are all of the ante-Nicene fathers. They're the ones that were prior to the first church council, which was at Nicene, or however, it's where we get the Nicene Creed, if you've ever heard of that, right? Where that's and we usually think of it in the Latin, not the Greek, it would have been in Greek in this, because that was in Greece. But the creed is called the creed because it begins credo, which means I believe. And so it's basically the list of things you have to believe if you're a Christian, that they decided at this council, and that was in, I think, is it 325? Yeah, down to 325. I think the Nicene Council was and there were actually more of them. It wasn't just the first one, so 325. So the first council that said this is what you have to believe if you're a Christian met in 325 AD, right? Has to be, and it was called by Constantine, who had recently reunified the empire, the Roman Empire. Right? It had split. One of the main reasons for the split was because of a fight between different types of Christians. There were followers of Arius, and there were followers of I'm not even supposed to have to look that one up. That one's supposed to be already Athanasius. Let's go. Obviously, they had a very posh place to meet. That's the 16th century fresco, so I'm sure they had no clue what the thing actually looked like. And in fact, I'm sure that these people are dressed the way they would have dressed in the 16th century and not in 325. I have an interesting thing, by the way. The Bishop of Rome did not have any attendees at this. So Rome was not represented in this. Kind of interesting. But so, you should actually get the creed somewhere. So I'll click on that. And there it is. Of course, the trouble is that's in Greek. But so, Athanasius believed that Jesus and God were the same. They were one God, not two different individuals. Arius believed, and this is why it's now called a heresy, right? So the Arian heresy. Let's do that. So here's the problem. Jesus is a separate individual, according to the Arian philosophy. So that's considered a heresy, and at the Council of Nicaea, right? So that's a split, a drastic split, and because Constantine the Great is behind this council, the conclusion of the council that Athanasius is correct and Arius is wrong means that you're no longer allowed to believe in the Arian point of view. So it's a heresy. So your books have to be destroyed. All your monks have to be retrained. All that stuff. No longer espouse the certain prayers and things that kind of indicated, the belief that Jesus was a separate individual than God, right? The Father. Notice there's no doubt at all that Jesus was an actual historical person. There's no doubt about that. By the way, I think it's really just silly to think that there wasn't such an individual. We have multiple sources, not just the New Testament that refer to him. Another main source that people can refer to is the works of Josephus, who you can still buy. It's on the internet, of course. So if have you ever heard of Josephus or Josephus?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so he's got his own version of the Jewish Bible. He also wrote the defense of Appian, which is the Latinized, or maybe it's the Greek version of Israel. He was actually hired, even adopted, by the Emperor Vespasian, and yet he was a Jewish noble himself, Josephus. He was, in fact, tagged to be the next leader who was going to be the head of the temple, as well as the replacement for King Herod and his line. So he was like unifying both the secular and the religious leadership in Israel at the time. But Israel revolted against the Romans, and Josephus was one of the generals. In fact, led the men that fought against the Romans at the place that eventually became known as Agamemnon. Shoot, boy, I'm getting old. It's the end of the world. What's that called?
Armageddon?
Armageddon, thank you. Harmageddon. Harm means hill, Geddon is the place. And by the way, there are ruins there. It's still there. You can visit it. Archaeologists have looked at it, and they're convinced that there was an earthquake at the time that the battle took place, because the walls fell in a certain way that crushed a lot of the men, and it couldn't have been done by the Roman machines. Well, I don't know. In any case, the Romans beat them, and in fact they famously all began to commit suicide rather than be captured, and Josephus was the very last one. They had done the straw thing, and so he helped all the others kill themselves, and then he was the last one, and he was supposed to kill himself. And he said, that would be not really the best thing to do, so instead he went and appealed to Vespasian and hailed him as the Messiah. By the way, this is why traditional Jews hate Josephus. It's kind of cool. It's pretty interesting. And Vespasian essentially adopted him, and that's why his full name, when we look at Josephus, is Flavius, which is the family name of Vespasian. So he's pretty interesting. So he was a good translator. The Vespasian used him to try to convince the Jewish people to surrender Jerusalem. He failed, so they totally destroyed Jerusalem. But he went on to write Vespasian's official history of the war against the Jews, as well as his own version of the Jewish Bible, and his defense of Appian. I forget if there were others besides that. But you could buy the collected works if you're interested. I ended up buying a copy. It was called the large print edition. I got it home and looked at it and realized I needed a magnifying glass to see the dang thing. But there's several places in his text where he refers to Jesus as a historical individual. A lot of people wondered, is this a book that could be trusted? Recently, though, relatively recently, within my lifetime, archaeologists using his text, his description of locales in Jerusalem have discovered that the Essene Gate is exactly where he said it was, right? So they never knew about the Essene Gate. He described it, referred to the Essenes. So he describes 3 different groups in Jerusalem, which he grew up in as an individual, of course. So he was familiar with the Essenes, as well as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So those are the 3 different religious groups in Jerusalem at the time. The Sadducees are those who take care of the temple. The Essenes were the very extremists that are associated also with the caves in Qumran and the baths there as well. So you can visit there by the shores of the Dead Sea. It's actually on the way, the road there. So you could look it up. I've gone there with my Oculus Rift and looked around and stuff. So that's kind of neat. So when you're looking at the three groups, the Essenes are the extremists, and there's of course then an interesting association with Jesus. Was he an Essene? Because there are a lot of similarities in the kinds of things he said and the Essenes. And the Essene Gate, by the way, is exactly where Josephus explained that it was. They've uncovered aspects of this. One of the things I remember seeing in Biblical Archaeological Review was pictures of the bathroom, because the Essenes believed it was immoral to pee in Jerusalem or to go to the bathroom period in Jerusalem, because it was a holy place. So you had to be at least like roughly 200 meters or something out of the city before you could go to the bathroom. And knowing the nature of people waking up, they figured it would be roughly right around that minimum, and so they found a bathroom that was well used right outside of the gate. So they convinced this was the bathroom that the Essenes used just outside of Jerusalem. Kind of interesting. So they're convinced that Josephus was not lying about his history or whatever. He was a good historian. You could rely on him. And since also he talks about Jesus, it's a second source to say that Jesus exists. There's lots of what the church, and when I say church, I usually mean the Catholic Church, because the others I would refer to as sects. It's just the way the Catholic Church talks about them. They're sectarian. We're not a member of the Catholic. Catholic just means universal, by the way. So that's what it means. So if you're not a member of the universal church, then you're a sectarian. It's just kind of weird. And so you capitalize church when you refer to that one. Small c, if you're talking about like, there's a church over there, that would be small c to refer to, right? If you say biblical as an adjective, you could use small b, but when you say Bible, it's inappropriate to use small b, because the Bible is a proper noun. That's the name of the book, right? So it's not a matter of, I'm a believer, so I'll capitalize it. It's proper English. I've had students give me grief. I don't believe in the Bible. Small b. And I say, well, but that's wrong. You have to put a capital B if you're saying I don't believe in the Bible, because that's a capital letter. I'm not taking sides here. I'm just, pointing out proper etiquette or whatever. Okay, so there's no doubt that Jesus actually existed. What is, of course, in doubt is what he said and did. during his lifetime, and why he had such an impact. Now, when we go back and look at the tradition, there are different traditions. So when we talk about the various books of the Gospel or the New Testament, the ones that the Council of Nicaea, 325, right? So that's 325 years after 0, so it's not 325 years after Jesus. And yes, that the church totally screwed that up because they had no year 1 that way. I mean, there should have been a year 0 and then 1, and they messed that up. But that's neither here nor there. But so if Jesus traditionally is understood to have lived to roughly 33, then why is that? Probably really the main reason for that is because 33 just seems like a magic number. That's probably one reason. He was roughly within a couple of years of that, though, they think. Of course, they're not absolutely sure exactly what year he would have been born. But if you take lots of the stories, etc., you could zero in on a particular year. But there are interesting problems. Herod never killed babies. No record of that. So the stories that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, probably false. He was probably born in Nazareth, which was where he was from. They didn't have traditions of having to move to a different town in order to register for the census. They did have Roman censuses. I don't know how to pluralize census. Censuses, I don't know. They did have those. They actually had those, so they actually have records. And then, by the way, the Romans kept all those records, and there's a lot of those records still available. So you could be really busy if you're trying to look into all of this stuff. Sepphoris was the biggest town near Nazareth. You could see Sepphoris from Nazareth. It's just in the hills up above Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was a very Roman and Greek town. In fact, the main language in Sepphoris was Greek because the Greeks had conquered it first, remember? So, and the Romans, when they moved in, they spoke Latin, but guess what? Most of their elite spoke Greek. Their literature was all Greek. We talked about this last week. The language that they used was the Koine Greek. Koine meaning the common Greek, right? So so when we talk about the New Testament, it was written in Koine Greek. His arguments was that a translation of an earlier version. I've never heard a scholar argue otherwise. They all seem to agree that it was written in Koine Greek. That there was probably some of the phrases were used in other languages. So what languages did Jesus speak? They believe he spoke 3. He would have spoken Aramaic, which was the language of the population in that area, other than the educated. But he would have also learned Greek, so he could speak in Greek, they would argue, because that was the language of business. So if he were coming into town and doing business, he would had to have spoken some Greek, at least. And he would have learned Hebrew, because if he was a rabbi, and they call him rabbi, then he would have been familiar with the Torah and been able to read it, and that would have meant Hebrew, right? So Jesus would have had 3 languages. Notice none of those are English, because English didn't exist yet. And so, if you're one of those folks, if English was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. That's no. I did have one college student here at UAA, absolutely appalled with me in my office when, she was absolutely convinced that the King James version, translation, that should be a hint, right, of the Bible was the original. No, how does this happen? You know, how could you think that way? I don't know. When on earth in my childhood did I discover that was the case? I don't know. Well, I mean, in college, of course, I had my New Testament in Greek class, right? So I still have a copy of the New Testament in Greek. And by the way, the first part of that book is English, explaining how the heck they put it together, because guess what? There's so many different sources. You have to explain yourself when you decide what pieces actually go into it, because there's lots and lots and lots. You know, so every single selection that they did have in there, they had footnotes underneath explaining exactly why they believed that was the correct piece to put in that particular sequence, etc. It was very complex. But so, yes, the Gospels were in Koine Greek, because that was the language of business at the time. And by the way, it wasn't very learned Greek, apparently, although you have individuals that were brilliant, that had great training. So St. Paul, for example, was a individual that studied under one of the rabbis who would have been one of the best rabbis available at the time. So, and Paul is the one who wrote epistles, the letters. Epistle just means letter. Epistula means letter. And so the epistles of Paul are considered by at least some, if not maybe there's a consensus on this, to have been the earliest literature associated with the Gospels, the New Testament. I keep mixing that together, but it should really be different. But the person who seemed to have been accompanying Paul on his travels was Luke. Now, arguments are that the Luke in that case was not the same Luke as the Apostle Luke. So that's kind of interesting. But the Acts of the Apostles is considered to have been written by Luke, and that was the same Luke that also wrote the Gospel Luke. So Luke, the Lucan tradition, is not considered to be written by the Apostle Luke, but instead by the Luke who accompanied Paul. And so the Luke Gospel and the Acts of the Apostle politically come from Paul's point of view, which turns out to be a significant. So where does the apparent dogma or opportunity for dogma come from? And basically, the scholars will argue that it's Paul. Paul had the education, and he was the one that took it on himself to be the one to convert everyone else. So his mission was to the non-Jewish members of the world, right? And so he parted ways with the pillar. Now, it's actually more complex than that, because if you're familiar with Paul, Paul was not a member of Jesus' group of friends, the 12 apostles, or the others that accompanied them. Right? Paul, in fact, first comes into the picture as an enemy of those individuals after Jesus has died. He comes in as a member of the Sadducees from the temple. He works at the temple. His job is to punish heretics who are... am I boring you guys, or is this interesting?
No, it's interesting.
This is interesting. And by the way, remember, you have to check everything I say with a fine-tooth comb, because I'm old and it amazes me that I remember anything. Uh, however, so initially Paul is the one, I believe, that's holding the cloak while they stone Stephen to death, right? So he's like helping them out. He's trying to find these Christians and weed them out. But famously, on the road to Damascus, he's knocked down by the light. So that's kind of interesting. By the way, the usual depiction of this is him falling off a horse. That's got to be false. He didn't have a horse. Paul did not he wasn't rich enough to have a horse. So that's kind of false. But he was knocked down by the light, and when he recovered, he was basically converted. Remember, I guess the great voice that he hears when he's knocked down is, Paul, why are you, actually Saul at the time, are you persecuting me? So Paul changes his name to Paul, is converted by an experience, not having actually met Jesus. So Paul, who's going to be politically the interpreter of Jesus' position in the universe, is not someone who's actually ever met Jesus, and is in controversy with what are referred to as the pillars of Jerusalem, which are Peter and the others that were the original followers of Jesus. So you end up, of course, with scholars writing books like Paul and the Invention of Christianity. So why? I mean, the argument here is that what becomes the actual dogmatic narrative here begins in Paul's letters, because Paul converts various towns, and these people include some Jewish people, but the Jewish people tended not to be persuaded by Paul's message. It was other people that seemed to be like other Greeks and everything. And so we get into sociological reasons. Why was Paul's message so persuasive for non-Jewish individuals? But as he would convert a particular town and then he would travel to another one, clearly they were sending letters or somehow communicating with him, indicating that they were puzzled over certain things he said, and they wanted more information. And so the epistles resulted from him sending these letters with responses back to them. And what happens then is, from one letter to the next, you see this gradual development of Jesus as having gone to the underworld to rescue all those souls that were there, and that Jesus was going to come again, and that second coming, then everyone who believed in him would essentially be saved for all eternity. Well, as you see the various letters, some of the people over years end up dying who've been saved by Paul. And so the people are obviously asking, hey, what about so-and-so? He's died now, and you promised him eternal life. And Paul says, oh, well, at the second coming, they will be resurrected. Whoa, where did that come from, right? So lots of interesting things Paul basically seems to develop in response to the questions that folks have for Paul. So that's why it's an invention here. So, I mean, when you contrast Paul with someone, like I mentioned last time, I think I mentioned this one, right? Honest to Jesus. So, Robert Funk, Honest to Jesus. If you read what Jesus really said, he was a man, and he had a philosophy that he was spreading that was a very good one, a very startling one, that basically said you should love even your enemies. So there's some significant things that Jesus says that were unusual, that were really powerful among the people that listened to him. And the stuff that Paul adds to it, which in a sense turns Jesus into a god, is not something that you would see if you were honest to Jesus. That's Robert Funk. But obviously the church accepts Paul, and in fact Paul becomes more important. Because remember, his Gospels through Luke are among the first. When we look at the Gospels, we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered the synopticon, which is one view, right? So, well, I could continue to look for something good, but I'll just use this primitive device here, I guess. So if you have, here's, let's start. So, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John is the odd one out, and probably the latest one. Probably written roughly around 80 AD. But these three are very similar. They're organized differently. They're not in the same sequence. But many of the things that are in one are not in the other, but they seem to be in harmony, right? A lot of interesting arguments, by the way, at the Nicene Council concerned what books were books that Christians ought to read. And they actually, not only books associated with Arius, but other books, which they labeled apocrypha, right? False readings. False writings. Right? Those are not the significant books that are important for being a good Christian. These books are. And so we get these plus John plus the letters that are like Peter. I mean, it wasn't just Paul that wrote letters, although keep in mind that Paul was literate. Peter was not. Peter Simon, Thomas, those were not considered, as far as we know, literate people. They're not even described that way. They're like fishermen and stuff. But John was considered a doctor, so that's interesting. He would have obviously been literate, and lived the longest, died a happy death, by the way, which is why he's like the patron saint of a happy death. All the others ended up being tortured one way or the other for their beliefs and so on, including Paul, who famously gets crucified upside down, I think, isn't he?
I think so.
Yeah. It's amazing how much you forget as you get older. But so when you look at these, there's an interesting question over the source of these. What was the source of these? Was it an oral source, or was there a written source? Most consider there to have been an oral source, so it was like passed down. Well, this is what I heard Jesus say. Now, if you think about it, Jesus would tell the same story multiple times. Like most of us, he probably got better at the story. So it depends on when you heard the story, what version of the story you heard, etc. But what made Jesus so powerful in talking about this? But so the source is usually referred to as the quella. Did I spell it right? Quella? Huh? In any case, they usually just refer to it as Q. But it comes from German. Am I spelling it right? Quella? The source? Oh, so E. German wouldn't have a noun ending in A. That's just weird. So it means the source, but so it began being referred to as the Q document. It's just hypothetical, though, as no one's ever found it. Although when some boys were digging around for lime along the Nile, and they hit into a urn that was buried along the one side of the Nile, and inside it they found all these texts. So they started bringing them home to Mom, and she thought, oh, this is great stuff. She started making sandals out of some of them, and the rest she started burning for fire. Meanwhile, the boys took some samples of it to a local guy who knew stuff, and he came running back and stopped Mom from burning or cutting up more of them, because what they had discovered were all the books that the Arians had to throw out. They dated from the Nicene Council, so it was a monastery across the river that had hidden their books rather than destroyed them, figuring that once that all blew over, they would be able to go retrieve them. Of course, obviously they never did, because this was 1950-something. And so they found a whole bunch of texts from the Arian tradition, including a complete book of Thomas, which probably have you heard of the Book of Thomas? Yes? Gosh, when I remember reading this stuff, it was like news. Now it's like everybody knows about it. Okay, so the Book of Thomas is a book of sayings. And so there are arguments that the Book of Thomas might have been associated with the Quella. Who knows? So this is just fun. This is just like a little tidbit of what I remember from all the different readings. There's so many different authors out there, of course, because Jesus is so important. The beginnings of Christianity is so important. There clearly was a historical Jesus. The church at the Nicene Council absolutely concluded certain things that became the foundation of Christianity at that point. And we have the creed here. Hopefully I actually have the original creed. Is it in here? There's the name Athanasian, as you can see. Why don't they actually have it? That's annoying. Obviously, there's lots of versions of the creed. It evolved, it changed as time went by. Wow, that's pretty interesting. Actual copy. Amazing. the main point I'd like to mention is that the solution to, if you think, was Jesus a man? The answer, no. Well, yes, he was a man, but that's not all he was. The second possibility, the Arian possibility, is that he was God, and a second God, actually, and that was denied. So that's a heresy. And there are contemporary sects that believe that heresy today. So that's kind of interesting. Latter-day Saints, for example, as far as I understand it, is one of those. Other historical versions of it. John Milton, the poet, the blind poet, who was the secretary for Oliver Cromwell and wrote Paradise Lost, etc., that his version of the Christian view was a heretical Arian point of view. Could also be tied in with what Augustine believed earlier in life when he was a follower of I can't think of the name, but before he became Orthodox, he invented Orthodoxy. Before he did that, he was a follower of a non-Orthodox one. So I can't remember the name of that. But we will when we get to it. In any case, so the solution is that Jesus is completely God. This is the Athanasian point of view. Right? Jesus is completely God, but also completely man, which is absolutely mystical or a puzzle, because how could that be? How could he be completely man, but at the same time completely God? And the answer is he is completely God, always was, always will be, always remains the same, one with God, but at the same time became man through the birth with the Blessed Mother. And by the way, that was the Immaculate Conception. Actually, the Immaculate Conception is the conception of Mary. The reason that has to be the case is because if Mary wasn't immaculate, she would not have been an appropriate vessel for Jesus to have been born. I spelled Immaculate Conception. So that she was the only human since Adam and Eve that was born without original sin. Is that weird or what? Are you familiar with this? A little bit. So it's not Jesus being conceived that was the Immaculate Conception. It was Mary herself was the Immaculate Conception. She is the Immaculate Conception. Notice this is 1854 when it becomes official. Should we take a break? Or is it still, it's still a little early. We've got about 15 minutes here. Okay, so, what have I covered? So he's both man and God. That's the orthodox conclusion. So Funk is wrong. I wouldn't even make it a religion. That would just make it a philosophy, actually. Of course, the mystical aspect to this is how could this be? How could he both be a physical man and yet at the same time be completely God? There's all kinds of modern literature that plays havoc with that. I don't know if you're familiar with some of the books, even more recent. I remember reading one, can't remember the title, but so Jesus is just a young boy. He's sitting, there with his brother or some other friends, and the one boy keeps squishing his slug, and he gets all upset because the slug is squished, And so Jesus keeps reinvigorating it. And no wand. Sorry, I'm thinking. There's a wand. No wand involved. But somehow Jesus. That's just a dumb story. Taking advantage of the puzzle of, how did this young boy who was God end up growing up as a kid? How all that kind of stuff. Okay. So what else? So why then does Christianity take over? Well, remember, of the various or philosophies that are prevalent in the Roman period leading up to this, one of the dominant ones is Plotinus and the Neoplatonist point of view, and when you contrast that to the others are convinced that your soul is the activity of the body. You should live to have a flourishing life here and now, because once your body dies, that's the end of your whole history, right? But when you're a Platonist, your soul continues on. Can't really argue why one particular philosophy would have flourished more than the others, but that was the preferred one through the Roman period. So when we have the early Roman theologians that are Christians, they prefer Plotinus. They prefer the Platonist philosophy as opposed to Epicurus. But Stoic philosophy actually bleeds over, and that turns out to be a practically good philosophy of life, even though you can actually believe Plato has the physics of the universe basically right? You could still be a Stoic, because Stoicism is still an attempt to basically be self-disciplined and control your own happiness and so on. Right? So the idea that you're controlling your happiness by disciplining yourself so that you're not going to get upset over whatever is bothering everyone else. It doesn't bother you. You're just stoically immune because you're capable of putting up with practically anything. Right? That turns out to be useful no matter what. And so Christians are certainly going to be Stoic. Augustine is clearly Stoic in nature. So you could still be Stoic, but you could still be a Neoplatonist. And so we'll move in and look at Augustine doing that. Let me get rid of some of this stuff. So, the writings of the Church Fathers down to the Nicene Council. There are some significant ones to think about. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus. Notice, by the way, that if you go to these sources here, you can actually go to the actual books. Everything is on here. Download the book or just read the book. Looks like they've changed it from the last time, so I just want to read it online. So if you want to become a biblical scholar, you have all of the resources available to you. And I don't know if you can get an idea just from this, but it would be easily a lifetime to get through this kind of stuff. Because we have all this stuff. Seems to have been at Philippi with St. Paul, etc. So, back. So just looking, so volume 1, volume 2, these are books, right? So if you look at these, you could look at the individuals from the 2nd century when it becomes Latin, primarily Tertullian, fathers of the 3rd century, continue, 3rd and 4th century. Recently discovered additions to early Christian literature. So that's kind of cool. So obviously, people are still finding more stuff. I mean, I read the other day that they're looking at a new cemetery that they've been digging up with thousands of Egyptians from the Coptic period, Coptic Greek. Right? So they're Christian, but speaking Greek in Egypt. And as they unwrap the mummies, the materials that they used to wrap the mummies were paper. And so the paper is actually like paper from telephone books. Whatever they threw out, you know, advertisements from Sears, the catalog, whatever they had. Okay, and then, so Augustine is after the Nicene Creed has been written. So that much is already set. It will evolve somewhat, but notice there's still lots of controversies that continue on. So we have some of the most famous, City of God, on the Holy Trinity. It was Mani that he was a follower of, which was bad. Don't follow Mani. Well, you can follow Mani if you like. All of this is like completely up to you today, because we're heretics. In the United States, we have what Peter Berger wrote is the heretical imperative. Being an American, you're a heretic. You're not allowed not to be, because the government will ask you, what's your religious preference? And you believe you have the right to choose your religious preference. And that's what defines a heretic, the belief that you have the right to choose for yourself. That's heresy. Sorry, but so whether you wanted to be a heretic or not, there you go. The good news, however, apart from the Gospels, which is apparently what gospel means, the good news, is that as far as we know, just being an American doesn't mean you're condemned to hell. Unless you live in New York. No, I don't. I don't. Actually, I think hell is in Oklahoma, isn't it? I remember getting a T-shirt from Camp Gruber, and it said, "Not hell, but you could see hell from here," and that was in Oklahoma. So Okay, so these are the ones that are going to that we'll be focusing on for tonight and a couple more nights. In the same way that we did. Let me double check. Actually, I should go back. Augustine is the one that's really important. Just like we covered Plato and Aristotle, a focus at this point will be Augustine. So, so tonight, the rest of our tonight we'll talk about Augustine and Augustine 2 and that. Okay, so after we come back from spring break, we'll spend the whole first night back talking about Augustine. By the way, Augustine, as far as I know, they're still finding sermons letters that he's written, explanations of interpretations of the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, and those are typically the kinds of sermons that young seminarians study to make their sermons, so that when they're giving their Sunday sermons, they're talking about various parts of the Bible. Augustine is still pretty basic to explanation of that. So, an awful lot of what I know an awful lot of people actually set themselves up as a preacher just based on their own reading of Scripture. And
You get into a lot of trouble.
yeah, well, I mean, that's where I think you get people that even think that the King James Bible is like the original. I don't know what else they come from, but if you're not looking at the history of the interpretation of the Scripture, I don't know how good that is. But let's take a break.
You can give us a quiz question?
Oh, I should. I suppose one of my biggest worries is in talking about this that I upset people. Because if you've grown up, your religion can be absolutely part of your heart and soul, give you a sense of what the meta-narrative of your life is. And to have someone, especially I tend, out of my nervousness, tend to make jokes about it, to be funny, so that I think that way I'll avoid getting people mad. But I think that very technique actually makes people even more angry. And there's no safe way to do this, right? So I suppose the question I have would be something like, does talking about this stuff make you nervous or anxious? Is that a good question? It really floored me. I remember when I was in college, I went to my first philosophy class totally clueless what was going to happen to me. I was raised Roman Catholic, believed what I was told. And it was taught to me at an age level that was really for children. I didn't get a sophisticated, I got Bible history, I got all sorts of stuff, but basically whenever it was about the dogma of the church, I was taught this is the dogma and that's true, period. And that's what I believed. And I got to college and I got hit with a more complex view of everything, and it floored me. And that, fortunately I didn't just take the one course, because I think that would have been dangerous, actually. I stayed in philosophy, taking philosophy courses for roughly 8 years. So that's why I'm so crazy. But, when you get enough of that, you realize that the first couple of critiques you hear aren't sufficient, that what you need to hear is the more complex versions of it. They come to realize eventually that actually, despite a lot of the criticisms, it's an incredibly valuable belief system that has a lot of right answers. In fact, a lot of the reason we have right answers is thanks to this historical development that comes from that. Liberalism, you think of the good things that our society offers to people, there's no doubt in my mind that that's essentially Christian. Even though, of course, as we go through the Middle Ages, we go through the Crusades, we go through the wars against the Protestants and the Catholics, and you end up with lots of reasons for thinking, boy, that was a horrible history. Clearly the religion didn't do great things for people all the time, but by the time you get to our contemporary situation, it makes you feel like it was thanks to that history that we've reached this point. That we could look back on that and even wonder if other cultures have to go through a similar Christianizing experience in order to become modern. But we'll talk about that
Because that could be puzzling, especially